Hi, this is Mrs. Nearing, and this video is going to talk about what happened in the flame test and atomic spectra lab that we just did. And before we get started talking about that, it's important to recognize that there are different forms of energy, like kinetic energy, potential energy, thermal energy, and light is also a form of energy. And light's part of this thing called the electromagnetic, it's a type of electromagnetic radiation, and visible light is part of that. And different colors of lights have different frequencies, and those correspond with different energies. And within those different colors, then there's low energy colors and high energy colors. And it's kind of the opposite of what you would think. Notice over here, the low energy colors are what we typically think of as like the hot colors, like red and orange. And the high energy colors are over here on the other end, the blues and purples. So light is a form of energy. Different colors of light have different energies associated with them, and the reds is low energy and the blues, purples are high energy light. And that's summarized here on this page. And this is the PowerPoint that is in your OneNote as well, if you want to look back at these PowerPoint slides. So how does that relate to the atom? Well, we know within the atom that electrons exist in these things called shells, and each shell is a certain distance from the nucleus, and those distances correspond to different energies. So the shells that are closest to the nucleus, like this shell right here, is going to have the lowest energy, and shells that are further from the nucleus are higher energy. And it's kind of similar to thinking about a ladder and the rungs on a ladder, and you can think of being similar to potential energy. If you're down here at the floor, you're going to have very low potential energy. As you climb up the ladder, you're going to have higher potential energy here as you move further and further away from the floor. Same kind of thing happening as the electrons moves away from the nucleus. That's higher and higher energy. Some vocab related to this. We say that when an electron is in the lowest available shell, the lowest available energy level, we say that it's in the ground state, and that's the stable position. We can also have electrons move around, and when they move into a higher energy level, a shell that's further away from the nucleus, we say that the electron is in an excited state. So ground state electrons are in the lowest possible energy level, lowest possible shell. When they're in the excited state, electrons can move up to higher shells, higher energy levels. So here's an animation showing this. So when the atom is heated, like if we apply some sort of energy source to your atom, these electrons that are right now in the ground state here, so they're in the lowest energy state right now, if you apply energy to those electrons, that energy can move into a higher energy state, into a shell that's further away from the nucleus, and we call that the excited state. So this electron right here is in an excited state. So moving away from the nucleus requires an input of energy, kind of like climbing up the rungs of a ladder requires energy for you to do that. In what we were doing in the flame test, their energy source was the flame. So we were applying thermal energy to the atom, and then the electrons absorb some of that thermal energy and convert it into potential energy as they move further away from the nucleus into a higher shell. The excited state is unstable, so electrons are not going to stay there. So you can think of it as being like wobbly. Okay, so this electron over here, unstable, and so it's going to want to fall back down into that ground state again. And as it's moving from high energy to a low energy location, and it's going to have to get rid of that extra energy somehow. That's kind of like if you fell off a ladder, that extra potential energy would get converted into maybe kinetic energy. In the case of the electron, that extra energy gets released in the form of light, because remember we said light is a form of energy. So that light that we see when we squirted the substance into the flame were those electrons getting rid of extra energy as they fell from a high energy state to a lower energy state. They're going from the excited to the ground state. So to summarize what's happening, normally electrons exist in the ground state. That's the stable kind of normal position. But the electrons can move between energy levels, between shells, by either absorbing or releasing energy. And when you apply energy to an electron by heating it or running electric current through it, the electrons will move into an excited state. That's the higher energy level. But that is unstable, so light energy is going to be released when those electrons in the excited state fall back down to the lower energy level, to those shells closer to the nucleus. So another example of this is looking at these atomic spectra. So when we looked at the atomic spectra, hopefully we saw data that looks a little bit like this. For each element we looked at, we should have seen a series of bands, and different elements have different color bands, and some had more than others, like neon had a lot of bands. Hydrogen only had a few, so you maybe only saw like 3 or 4 bands of light in your hydrogen spectrum. Whereas in neon, you probably saw a lot more bands of light. So this is what our data should look like from the atomic spectra portion of the lab. So let's think about what's going on here. So remember, light energy is being released when electrons fall down from a higher energy level, so a higher shell, to a lower shell that's closer to the nucleus. And you want to think about how color relates to jump size. So notice, like in this picture, we've got 4 possible shells this electron can be in. Really, we've got even more possibilities, but we're just drawing 4 here. So we've got our ground state electron. When it gets excited, it can jump into a variety of places. It can go into the second shell, third shell, fourth shell, and depending on where that electron ends up, when it falls back down to the ground state, that might be a really big jump or it might be a small jump. So in this case, it looks like our electron got excited up into the 4th shell, which is relatively far away from the nucleus. So when it goes from the 4th shell back down to the 1st shell, that's a relatively large change in energy. So this might release like blue or purple light, because remember, blue and purple are higher energy colors of light than like red or orange. So that's a pretty big jump. If that electron were to make a smaller jump, let's say from the 2nd shell to the 1st shell, it's going to release a different color of light. It's going to release some lower energy light because it's a smaller energy difference between those 2 shells. So this size jump might release like red light or orange light. So here's a picture actually showing what's happening in hydrogen. And there's a lot of more complicated stuff going on here, but you can see that there's lots of different movements that your electron can make. So it can jump from shell 2 to 1, or shell 3 to 1, or shell 4 to 1, or it can jump from shell 4 to 2, or 3 to 2. There's lots of different jumps it can make. And you'll see here that the smaller jumps correspond to red light being released. The larger jumps over here correspond to like blue or purple light being released. And there's these other jumps here that correspond to even higher energy things like UV light, which we can't even see. But we'll focus on just the things we can see, which are the different colors. So the main idea here is that larger jumps release more energy, so that will look maybe blue, purple. The smallest jumps release less energy, those would be like red, orange, and the ones in the middle are like your greens and yellows. So here's another picture showing what's happening there. Again, you can see our larger jumps release violet light. The smallest jump is the one releasing the red light, and then we have some like maybe blues and greens are there in the middle. So hopefully this helps. Let me know if you have any more questions.